Welcome to the Midnight Audiobook Club, your cozy late-night sanctuary for the world's greatest literature. Before we dive into tonight's extraordinary tale, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and click the notification bell. Your support helps us keep the night alive with stories, and you won't miss any of our upcoming midnight journeys. Tonight's story is a small one. Small in the way that certain things are small. A single candle, a cup of tea, a child's hand in yours. Small in a way that does not prevent it from containing something large. It is a story about love. About what happens to a person when they love completely, and about what happens when the person they love goes away. And about what happens, finally, when love finds somewhere new to go. Before we meet the woman at the center of this story, let us spend a few minutes with the man who imagined her. Anton Pavlovich Chekhov was born on the 29th of January, 1860, in Taganrog, a small port city on the Sea of Azov, in the south of Russia. His grandfather had been a serf, a man who was legally owned, who had worked his entire life to purchase his family's freedom. His father, the grandson of that serf, owned a small grocery shop and ran his household with strict religious discipline. Neither circumstance was unusual for Russia in the middle of the 19th century. What was unusual was Chekhov himself. When Anton was 16, his father's business failed. The family fled to Moscow in the night to avoid debtor's prison, leaving the teenage Anton behind alone, to finish his schooling, to support himself by tutoring younger students, to manage on his own for 3 years before he could join them. He was 16 years old when this happened. He dealt with it practically, without complaint, and went on. This practicality, this quiet ability to face difficult things and keep going, would characterize him for the rest of his life. It also, perhaps, explains why his stories feel the way they do, not dramatic, not theatrical, not arranged for maximum emotional impact, but honest. The way life is honest when you have been paying attention to it long enough to stop expecting it to be otherwise. He enrolled in medical school at the University of Moscow, and to pay the fees for his tuition, for his family's rent, for the daily necessities of 6 people living in a city on almost nothing, he began writing. Short, comic pieces for popular magazines, written quickly, sometimes in a single evening, signed with pen names to protect his professional reputation as a future doctor. He was 20 years old. He published over 300 pieces in 4 years, while simultaneously completing a full medical degree. He qualified as a physician in 1884. He later described his relationship to his 2 vocations with characteristic dry precision. Medicine is my lawful wife, and literature is my mistress. He practiced medicine for the rest of his life, treating peasants in the countryside, often for free, organizing famine relief, campaigning for better conditions in schools and prisons. In 1890, he made an extraordinary journey to the penal island of Sakhalin, off the far eastern coast of Russia, to document the conditions of the prisoners there. It was a journey of thousands of miles, through Siberia, by road and river and rail, in the cold. He went because he believed someone should go and look, and write down what they saw. This, too, was characteristic of him. He believed in the value of looking, of paying careful, honest attention to things, people, places, lives, and rendering them on the page as accurately as possible, without sentimentality, without judgment, without arranging them to mean something they did not actually mean. In the late 1880s, the tuberculosis that would eventually take his life began to make itself known. He spent his final years between Moscow and Yalta, in the warmer south, where the doctors had sent him. In 1901, he married an actress named Olga Knipper, who had starred in the Moscow Art Theatre productions of his plays. Their marriage was conducted largely by correspondence. She stayed in Moscow for her career, while he stayed in Yalta for his health, and they wrote each other over 800 letters. He died on the 15th of July, 1904, at a spa town in Germany's Black Forest. He was 44 years old. His last words, reportedly, were spoken in German, the language of the country he was dying in, a language he barely knew. And then, a moment later, something very like himself. Ich sterbe, I am dying. And then, I haven't had champagne for a long time. A doctor to the end, noting the symptoms. A writer to the end, finding the precisely right detail for the moment. Tonight's story was published in 1899, 5 years before his death, and it is among the most loved things he ever wrote. Its title in Russian is Dushix, which translates as the darling, though the original is richer. Dushix is a diminutive of dusha, meaning soul. The title might be read as Little Soul, and that phrase contains, in miniature, everything this story is about. When Leo Tolstoy read it, Tolstoy, who disagreed with Chekhov about almost everything and admired him enormously anyway, he had tears in his eyes. He said that Olenka, the woman at the story's center, embodied the highest form of human love, the love that asks nothing for itself, that gives completely, that finds all its meaning in devotion to another person. He called her love, the work that brings human beings nearest to God. Chekhov, reading this, said nothing. He rarely did. He had not written the story to make a point. He had written it to show a life, and he trusted his readers to feel whatever they genuinely felt, without him telling them what to feel. That is the invitation we extend to ourselves tonight. We will listen, we will form our own opinions, and we will see whether, by the end, we understand something we did not understand before, about love, or about loneliness, or about the particular courage it takes to keep opening yourself to the world after the world has repeatedly taken away the people you gave yourself to. It is a warm summer evening in a small Russian town, sometime in the 1890s. Dark rain clouds are gathering from the east, bringing from time to time a breath of moisture in the air. In the courtyard of a house on the edge of town, a young woman is sitting quietly on her back porch, lost in thought. Her name is Olenka, and she has, as she has always had, an enormous capacity for love, and, at this particular moment, no one to give it to. That is about to change. Here is Anton Chekhov's The Darling. Part 1. Kukin and the Theatre. Olga Semyonovna, or Olenka, as everyone called her, was the daughter of a retired civil servant named Plemianikov, and she lived in the small wooden house he had left her, at the far edge of town. She had grown up gentle, healthy, soft-hearted, always fond of someone. She simply could not exist without loving. As a girl, she had loved her papa, who now sat breathing with difficulty in a darkened room. She had loved her aunt, who visited every other year from a town called Bryansk, and once, briefly, at school, she had loved her French teacher. She had full rosy cheeks, a soft white neck, with one small dark mole upon it, and a kind, naive smile that came over her face whenever she heard something pleasant. Men who met her thought, quietly to themselves, not half bad, and smiled. Lady visitors would clasp her hand mid-sentence and exclaim, "You darling." It was a name that simply seemed to belong to her. Living in the lodge attached to her house was a thin, anxious little man with a yellow face and curls combed forward on his brow. Ivan Petrovich Kukin, manager of an open-air pleasure garden called the Tivoli, where actors performed light comic operettas and masks beneath the summer sky. Every evening, it seemed, the rain came, and every evening Kukin stood in the middle of the garden, staring up at the clouds and wringing his hands. It was hot. Dark rain clouds were gathering from the east and bringing from time to time a breath of moisture in the air.
"Rain again!"
he would cry, his mouth working to one side as he spoke, his voice a thin, despairing tenor.
As though to spite me. I might as well hang myself. One works and does one's utmost, gets no sleep at night, racks one's brain, and what happens? The public is ignorant, boorish. I give them the finest operetta, first-rate artists, and what do they want? A clown. Vulgarity. That's what they ask for. And the weather. It has rained since the 10th of May, straight through June. I have to pay the rent regardless, pay the artists regardless, and the public simply does not come.
The next evening the clouds would gather again, and he'd laugh, half hysterical.
Well, rain away then. Flood the garden and drown me. Send me to Siberia, to the scaffold. Ha ha ha.
He said all of this to Olenka, who listened from her porch with quiet, full attention, and she felt what he felt. The rain that ruined his performances genuinely troubled her. The public's lack of appreciation genuinely distressed her. When he sighed, she sighed. When he spoke of the theatre as a great civilizing force, as the finest thing in the world, as the one institution that elevated the human spirit, she nodded and felt that this was true, and began to feel it with the particular certainty of a person who has not chosen a belief so much as absorbed it from someone they love. Olenka listened to him with silent gravity, and sometimes tears came into her own eyes at his troubles, until at last, quite without meaning to, she found she loved him. In the evenings she would lie awake, listening to the band play at the Tivoli and the crackle of fireworks, imagining it was Kukin himself out there struggling against his fate, and her heart would thrill with a sweet ache on his behalf. Because she was falling in love with him. Quietly, gradually, the way a morning comes, not all at once, but through an accumulation of small warmths, until suddenly the room is full of light. He proposed one evening in May, and she accepted, and they were married. A simple ceremony, nothing extravagant, followed by a good supper. Looking at her plump white shoulders for the first time as a husband might, he murmured,
"You darling."
Though, since it rained on his wedding night too, his face kept its usual look of despair regardless. They got on well together. Olenka sat in the ticket office, watched over the refreshment bar, corrected the actors at rehearsal, and kept a careful eye on the musicians. The actors, fond of her, took to calling her Vanichka and I, and the darling, and she lent them small sums when they were short, weeping quietly to herself, in private, whenever they failed to pay her back, never once complaining of it to her husband. Soon she began repeating, word for word, everything Kukin said about art and the public's poor taste, until his opinions had entirely become her own. When people met her on the street and asked how things were at the theatre, she told them, fully, with authority. She spoke of the theatre the way people speak of things they have devoted their lives to. When anyone said anything disparaging about the theatre, that it was frivolous, or that the performances were not up to standard, she felt personally affronted.
The theater is the most important thing in life,
she would tell her acquaintances, quite gravely, in his exact turn of phrase.
It's only through drama that one can become truly cultivated and humane. But do you suppose the public understands that? Yesterday we gave a fine piece and the boxes were half empty, but if we'd put on something vulgar, why, the house would have been packed to the doors.
The neighbors called her the darling. They meant it as a compliment. Their life together was orderly and comfortable. They worked hard. They were proud of what they were building. And in the evenings, after the last performance, they would walk home together through the quiet streets, talking about the season, about the audiences, about everything that mattered to them. And Olenka felt, in those evening walks, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They got on well together in the winter too. They took the town theatre for the whole season and let it out, in shorter stretches, to a travelling company, a conjurer, or the local dramatic society. Olenka grew stouter and always seemed to beam with satisfaction, while Kukin, by contrast, grew ever thinner and more sallow, forever complaining of terrible losses, even in a winter that had, in truth, not gone badly at all. He coughed through the nights, and Olenka nursed him with hot raspberry tea, rubbed his chest with eau de cologne, and wrapped him in her own warm shawls.
You're such a sweet pet,
she'd tell him, quite sincerely, stroking his hair.
Such a pretty dear.
That winter, toward Lent, business called Kukin to Moscow to gather a new troupe for the coming Easter season. Without him in the house, Olenka could not sleep. She sat up whole nights at her window, watching the stars, comparing herself, she thought, to the hens who stay restless and wakeful when their rooster is away. He wrote that he'd be home for Easter, with a few last instructions about the Tivoli. Then, on the Sunday before, late in the evening, came a sudden ominous knocking at the gate. Someone hammering as though on a barrel, boom, 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 and the cook went flopping barefoot through the puddles to answer it. It was a telegram. Ivan Petrovich died suddenly today. Funeral Tuesday.
My darling!
Olenka sobbed, over and over, through that whole terrible week.
Vanka, my precious! Why did I ever meet you, only to lose you?
She came home from his funeral in Moscow and wept so loudly the neighbors could hear her through the walls, out in the street. She wept without restraint, the open, full weeping of someone who has lost not just a person, but a whole version of themselves. She wore mourning. She put flowers on the grave. She accepted the condolences of the neighbors with quiet dignity. And then, when the formal period of grief was done, and the house was empty and still, Olenka sat in her porch in the spring air, the same porch where she had sat listening to him complain about the rain, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the particular emptiness of having no one to love. It was the loneliness not of solitude, but of abundance with nowhere to go. She had so much to give, and there was no one to give it to. She sat in the courtyard, and the spring was very beautiful, and she felt nothing in particular about it. Part 2. Pustovalov and the Timber Yard. The Tivoli's lanterns had gone dark for good that year. Grief, as it often does, took its own quiet time to loosen its hold on Olenka. but life in a small town moves forward whether we're ready or not, and spring came again, as it always does, whether or not our hearts have caught up with it. 3 months passed. One day, walking home from Mass in her deep mourning, Olenka found herself beside a neighbor, Vasily Andrich Pustovalov, manager at Babakayev's timber yard, a calm, dignified man in a straw hat and white waistcoat, with a dark beard and a gold watch chain, who looked rather more like a country gentleman than a man in trade.
"Everything happens as it is ordained, Olga Semyonovna,"
he told her gravely, with real sympathy in his voice, as he walked her to her gate.
"If our dear ones die, it must be God's will, and we ought to bear it with fortitude."
All that day afterward, she found herself hearing his sedate, dignified voice, and whenever she shut her eyes, seeing his dark beard, she liked him very much. It seemed the feeling was returned, for not long after, an elderly lady she barely knew came to drink coffee with her, and spent the whole visit praising Pustovalov, an excellent man, thoroughly dependable, the kind any girl would be glad to marry. 3 days later he called himself. He stayed only about 10 minutes and said very little, but when he left, Olenka found she loved him so completely she lay awake that whole night in a perfect fever of feeling, and sent for the elderly lady first thing in the morning. The match was arranged quickly, and soon there was a wedding. They got on very well together. Pustovalov generally sat in the office until dinner time, then went out on business, while Olenka took his place at the desk, keeping the accounts and booking orders until evening.
Timber gets dearer every year. The price rises 20%.
She would tell customers and friends, exactly echoing him.
We used to sell local timber, and now Vasichka has to go all the way to the Mogilev district for wood. And the freight!
And she'd press her hands to her cheeks in genuine horror, as though the cost of freight were a sorrow entirely her own. Every day at noon, their whole yard filled with the smell of beetroot soup and roast duck or mutton, and on fast days, fish, so that no one could pass their gate without feeling a pang of hunger. In the office, the samovar was always kept boiling, ready for any customer who stopped in, along with a plate of cracknels. Once a week, Pustovalov and Olenka went together to the public baths and came home afterward side by side, both red-faced and glowing. It seemed to her she had been in the timber trade for years and years, that nothing in the world mattered more than timber, and there was something almost tender to her in the very sound of words like balk, beam, post, plank. At night she dreamed of great mountains of boards, of long lines of carts hauling wood into the distance, of a whole regiment of towering beams marching upon the timber yard and toppling with a resounding crash over and over, and she would cry out in her sleep,
"Olenka, what's the matter, darling? Cross yourself."
Pustovalov would murmur tenderly, and she would settle again. Her husband's opinions were hers entirely, down to the smallest habit. If he thought a room too warm, so did she. He cared nothing for the theatre, and stayed home on holidays. She did likewise.
Vasichka and I have no time for such nonsense,
she'd say, quite sedately, to friends who suggested she go out and enjoy herself.
What's the use of theaters?
On Saturdays they went to evening service together, and on holy days to early Mass, walking home afterward side by side with softened faces, her silk dress rustling pleasantly. At home there was tea with fancy bread and jam,
We have nothing to complain of, thank God.
She liked to tell people.
I wish everyone were as fortunate as Vasichka and I.
When business took Pustovalov away to buy timber, Olenka missed him terribly and lay awake crying, though a young army veterinary surgeon named Smirnin, who rented their lodge, would sometimes come sit with her those evenings, talk and play cards, which eased the loneliness a little. And so 6 years passed this way, quietly and peaceably, in complete harmony. Then one winter day, after drinking hot tea in the office, Pustovalov went out into the yard without his hat to see about a shipment of timber. He came home with a wet head. He complained of feeling unwell. He took to his bed. The illness that followed was slow and serious. Olenka nursed him through 4 months of it, sitting by his bed through the nights, arranging his medicines, managing the yard as best she could during the days, refusing to allow herself to believe what the doctors' faces told her. She was a practical woman. She did practical things. She nursed him. He died in February, exactly a year after falling ill.
I've nobody now you've left me, my darling.
Olenka sobbed at his funeral.
How can I live, all alone in the world?
She wept as she had wept for Kukin, fully, without restraint. She wore mourning for 6 months. For half a year she barely left the house except to visit church, or her husband's grave, as the neighbors said, very much like a nun. The neighbors, passing her gate, glimpsed her occasionally through the window, sitting, still, looking at nothing in particular. They said she had aged. They said she was to be pitied. They said, "Poor darling." They were right. She was to be pitied, not because she had lost a husband, people lose husbands, but because she had lost, for the second time, the frame around which herself was organized. The timber yard went on without her. The business continued, but the opinions about timber, the things she had known and cared about and discussed with such warmth, drained quietly away, the way water drains from a vessel that has been tipped on its side. When neighbors asked her what she thought about the trade, she could not say. She thought nothing. She felt nothing in particular about anything. Part 3. Smirnin and the Empty Years. Slowly the shutters opened again. 6 months after Pustovalov's death, Olenka began to be seen taking tea in her garden with Smirnin, the veterinary surgeon who had rented her lodge all these years, the same man who used to keep her company on the evenings Pustovalov travelled for timber, telling her of his own unhappy home, a wife who'd been unfaithful, a small son he supported with 40 rubles a month, sent off dutifully, though he could no longer bring himself to forgive her. Olenka had always been sorry for him.
You should make it up with her, Vladimir Platonich.
She used to tell him.
For your boy's sake, at least.
Now, in her widowhood, that old friendship deepened into something closer, something the town could only guess at, though no one thought ill of Olenka for it. Everything she did seemed so natural. She could not live a year, it seemed, without some attachment, and had found new happiness in the lodge. Once again, she began speaking with total, borrowed conviction, this time about cattle plague, foot-and-mouth disease, municipal slaughterhouses, exactly as Smirnin did.
There's no proper veterinary inspection in this town,
she'd tell an acquaintance at the post office, quite gravely.
And that's the cause of all sorts of epidemics. People are always catching infections from the milk or from horses and cows. The health of animals ought to be looked after just as carefully as the health of people.
Neither of them spoke of the change in their relations to anyone else, and both tried to keep it quiet, but Olenka could never keep a secret. When Smirnin had fellow officers over for supper, and she poured the tea, she would launch, quite unprompted, into the cattle plague or the town slaughterhouse before his mortified guests, until afterward he'd seize her by the hand and hiss,
"I've asked you before not to talk about what you don't understand. When we're discussing shop, please don't put your word in. It's really annoying."
and she would look back at him in genuine dismay,
But Volodichka, what am I to talk about?
and with tears in her eyes she'd embrace him, begging him not to be cross, and they would both in the end be happy again. But this happiness did not last long. Smirnin's regiment was transferred. He came to say goodbye and thanked her for her kindness, and said he hoped she would be well, and left. The lodge stood empty again. This time, truly, absolutely alone. Her father had long since died. His old armchair sat gathering dust in the attic, lame in one leg. She grew thinner and plainer. People passing her in the street no longer looked at her, no longer smiled, the way they once had. Her best years, it seemed, were behind her now. In the evenings she sat on her porch and heard the band still playing at the Tivoli, the fireworks still popping, but none of it stirred anything in her any more. She looked at her own yard without interest, wished for nothing, thought of nothing, ate and drank as though unwillingly. And worst of all, she found she had no opinions left of her own to give. She could look at a bottle, or the rain, or a peasant driving his cart, and understand well enough what she was seeing, yet be entirely unable to say what any of it meant, what it was for. Not for 1,000 rubles could she have explained it. How dreadful to have no opinions at all. When she'd had Kukin, or Pustovalov, or the veterinary surgeon, she could explain anything under the sun, give her view on any subject you liked. Now there was only the same flat emptiness in her heart as there was in the overgrown yard outside, bitter as wormwood in the mouth. She accepted, without a word of her own, whatever her cook Mavra happened to say, and so it went, day after day, year after year, with no joy and no opinions of her own at all. The town grew and changed around her. The dirt road became a proper street, and where the Tivoli and the timber yard had once stood, new turnings and houses appeared. How quickly the years pass! Olenka's own roof went rusty, her shed sank to one side, and docks and stinging nettles overtook the whole yard. She herself grew plain and elderly, sitting through the summers on her porch, with a soul as empty and dreary as before, and through the winters at her window watching the snow. Whenever the scent of spring reached her, or the church bells chimed, some sudden rush of old memory would come over her, a tender ache in her chest, tears brimming in her eyes, but only for a minute, and then the same emptiness returned, the same sense of the pointlessness of things. A little black kitten, Briska, rubbed against her skirts and purred softly, but it was no comfort at all. That was not what she needed. She wanted, she knew, a love that could absorb her whole being once more, her whole soul and reason, something to give her ideas again, an object in life, something to warm her old blood.
Get along,
She'd say, shaking the kitten off her skirt in vexation.
I don't want you.
Years passed. She did not count them. She was aware, in the way that one is aware of weather, that time was moving, that she was no longer young, that the neighbors who had known her in her full years now looked at her with a kind of gentle, unintrusive pity, Poor Olenka, they said, such a shame. She was such a darling. She sat in her porch. The evenings came and went, and somewhere, at a distance she could not quite measure, in a direction she could not name, she waited for the thing that would make her herself again. She did not know that it was coming. She did not know its name yet, but it was coming. Part 4. Sasha. One hot July evening, as the cattle were being driven home and the whole yard filled with dust, someone knocked at Olenka's gate. She opened it herself and was dumbfounded to see, standing there, Smirnin. Grey-headed now, dressed as a civilian, no longer a soldier at all. Everything came flooding back to her at once. She burst into tears at the very sight of him, letting her head fall against his chest without a word, and somehow, still crying, they found themselves indoors, sitting down to tea together, as though no years had passed at all.
My dear Vladimir Platonich, what brings you here?
She managed, trembling with joy.
I mean to settle here for good, Olga Semyonovna.
He told her.
I've resigned my post. I want to try my luck on my own account now. And besides, it's time my boy started school. He's quite a big fellow now. I've made it up with my wife, you know.
Where is she?
Olenka asked.
At the hotel, with the boy. I'm looking for lodgings.
Lodgings!
Olenka cried, already beginning to cry again, this time from happiness.
Good gracious! Why lodgings, my dear soul? Take my house. Why, I wouldn't dream of charging you a kopeck. You live here, and the lodge will do nicely for me. Oh, how glad I am!
By the very next day the roof was being freshly painted and the walls whitewashed, and Olenka moved about the yard with her arms akimbo, giving directions to the workmen, brisk and alert and beaming with her old smile, as though she had woken from a long sleep. Smirnin's wife arrived not long after, a thin, plain woman with short hair and a rather peevish expression, and with her came the boy, Sasha, just 10 years old, small for his age, blue-eyed, chubby-cheeked, with a dimple in each cheek. He had scarcely set foot in the yard before he was off chasing the cat, and at once his gay, delighted laughter filled the air.
Is that your puss, Auntie?
He asked Olenka.
When she has kittens, will you give us one? Mama's dreadfully afraid of mice.
Olenka talked with him and gave him tea, and felt a strange, sweet ache settle in her chest, as though the boy had always been her own. In the evenings, as he sat at her table going over his lessons, she watched him with such tenderness that she murmured to herself, half aloud,
You pretty pet, my precious, such a fair, clever little thing.
When he stumbled through his reading,
An island is a piece of land which is entirely surrounded by water.
she repeated the sentence back to him, slowly, thoughtfully.
An island is a piece of land,
She said, and it was the very first opinion she had spoken with real positive conviction in years of silence. He was a good boy, though complicated, as 10-year-old boys always are. He had strong opinions about his teachers, particularly about mathematics, which he found unreasonably difficult, and about a certain lesson that had not been explained properly. He had strong opinions about the other boys, about who was fair and who was not. He had, in general, strong opinions about everything, delivered with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been embarrassed enough times to become cautious about having them. Olenka listened. She listened with the full, warm, complete attention she had once given to Kukin's complaints about the rain, to Pustovalov's thoughts about timber prices, to Smirnin's concerns about livestock disease. And as she listened, The familiar warmth began to rise in her, the warmth that had been still and cold for so many years, and she felt it moving through her like the first real warmth of spring, unexpected and overwhelming and entirely welcome. Now she had opinions of her own again, and at supper she told Sasha's parents, with great seriousness, how difficult lessons at the high school were nowadays, but how it was still far better than a commercial school, since a high school education opened every career, whether one wanted to become a doctor or an engineer. Smirnin's wife, thin and peevish as she was, listened without much interest, while Smirnin himself nodded along, plainly pleased to hear Olenka speak with such conviction again. Sasha started at the high school. Not long after, his mother left for a visit to her sister in a town called Kharkov and never returned. His father, an army man turned civilian now, was away nearly every day inspecting cattle across the district, sometimes gone 3 whole days at a stretch, and it began to seem to Olenka that the boy was entirely abandoned, unwanted at home, half-starved, utterly alone. So she carried him off to live with her in the lodge and gave him a small room of his own there. For 6 months now, Sasha had lived with her that way. Every morning she came into his little room and found him fast asleep, one hand tucked beneath his cheek, and it always pained her a little to wake him.
Sashenka,
She'd say mournfully.
get up, darling. It's time for school.
He'd rise, dress, say his prayers, then sit down and drink 3 glasses of tea and eat 2 large cracknels and half a buttered roll, still half asleep and a little cross about it, the way boys are in the mornings.
You don't quite know your fable, Sashenka.
She'd fret, looking at him as though he were setting off on some long and dangerous journey.
What a lot of trouble you give me. You must work hard, darling, and mind your teachers.
Oh, do leave me alone.
He'd grumble, but not unkindly. Then he'd set off down the street to school, a small figure under a big cap, satchel on his shoulder, and Olenka would follow noiselessly behind.
Sashenka!
She'd call after him, pressing a date or a caramel into his hand. When he reached the street where the school stood, he would turn, a little ashamed at being trailed by a tall, stout woman, and say,
"You'd better go home, Auntie. I can go the rest of the way alone."
She would simply stand and watch, fixed to the spot, until he had disappeared through the school gate. Ah, how she loved him! Of all her former attachments, not one had gone so deep. Never had her whole soul surrendered itself so spontaneously, so disinterestedly, so joyfully, as now that her long-dormant maternal instinct had finally been stirred awake. For this small boy, with the dimpled cheeks and the oversized school cap, she would have given her whole life gladly, with tears of tenderness. Why? Who can say why? She'd come home afterward glowing, looking younger than she had in years, and chatter happily at the market about how difficult the lessons were this term, repeating, almost word for word, whatever Sasha himself had told her the evening before.
The lessons at the high school are so hard now.
She'd tell the other women, shaking her head.
Yesterday, in the very first class, they gave him a whole fable to learn by heart, and a Latin translation besides, and a problem to work out. It's really too much for such a little fellow.
And she'd go on at length about the teachers, the school books, the whole business of it, saying, without quite realizing it, exactly what Sasha himself had said. At 3 o'clock they had dinner together. In the evenings they sat over his lessons side by side, and sometimes both of them, worn down by some particularly stubborn Latin passage, ended up close to tears. When she put him to bed, she would linger a long while, making the sign of the cross over him again and again, murmuring a prayer, before finally going to bed herself, where she dreamed of some distant, misty future. Sasha grown into a young man, a doctor perhaps, or an engineer, with a fine house of his own, horses, a carriage, a wife, children of his own one day. She would fall asleep, still turning the thought over, tears slipping down her cheeks even as she slept, while the black cat purred beside her, low and steady. But one particular fear had begun to visit her almost every night. A sudden knock would come at the gate, loud, and she'd wake breathless, her heart hammering, certain, in that first terrible half-second, that it must be a telegram from Kharkov, that Sasha's mother had sent for him at last, was calling him away from her for good. For one unbearable minute, Olenka would feel she was the most wretched woman in the whole world, her head and hands and feet all gone cold with dread. And then, always, a moment later, voices in the yard, footsteps she recognized. It was only Smirnin, home late from his club.
Well, thank God,
She'd think, and feel the terrible weight lift from her chest, and settle back into bed, thinking of Sasha, sound asleep in the very next room. Except that sometimes, in his sleep, the boy called out, sharp, sudden words, entirely his own, from some dream she could not follow, and had no part in at all.
I'll give it you! Get away! Shut up!
Olenka looked at him for a long moment. Then a smile spread slowly across her face, the smile of someone watching something dear. She stood in the doorway for a while longer. Then she went quietly back to her room and got into her bed and lay there in the dark, smiling still. Her heart was full, her chest was warm. The house around her was full of breathing, full of life, full of the particular aliveness that comes from having someone you love under the same roof. She thought, I am not alone, and this thought, which she had not been able to think with any truth for many years, was so large and so comfortable that she fell asleep almost immediately, still holding it. Epilogue. Let's stay with it a little while longer before we say good night. We have just spent an hour with one of the warmest, most quietly complicated women in all of Russian literature, and we want to sit with her for a few more minutes, not to explain her, Chekhov would not have approved of that, but simply to think alongside her, the way we think alongside a story that has left something in us that we are not quite ready to put down yet. When Olenka is loving someone, she is a great soul. She is generous, attentive, entirely present. She gives herself without holding anything back. She takes on the concerns of the person she loves, their worries, their opinions, their professional language, and she carries them with a warmth that makes everything feel important. The people she loves are cared for in a way that most of us can only imagine being cared for. But when she is alone, when the person she has organized herself around is gone, the soul shrinks. Or not quite shrinks, it empties. She has no opinions, she has nothing she wants to say about the world. She sits in her porch and watches the street and thinks nothing in particular, because her thinking has always been a collaboration, and there is no one to collaborate with. Is this the most beautiful kind of love, or a kind of emptiness that has learned to wear love's clothing? We think Chekhov's answer is, it is both, simultaneously, and he trusts us to hold both things at once, without resolving the tension between them, because that is what the truth asks of us, sometimes, to hold two things that do not quite fit together and resist the urge to make them fit. What strikes us most, coming out of this story, is the empty years. Not the loves, those are vivid and warm and easy to follow, but the years between them, when Olenka sits in her courtyard with her cats and her blank face turned toward the street, the years when she has no opinions, when the town changes around her and she watches it change without feeling anything particular about any of it. We know those years, not necessarily in the specific form Olenka experiences them, but we know what it is to feel unanchored from ourselves, to look at our own life and feel vaguely that someone else is living it, to have lost, temporarily, the thing that made our days feel purposeful and shaped. Chekhov does not judge Olenka for these years. He does not suggest she should have developed her own independent identity, or found a hobby, or learned to be content with solitude. He simply shows us what those years look like in their honest ordinariness, and trusts us to recognize something. And most of us, if we are honest, recognize something. There is a reading of Olenka's life that sees it as a series of losses, 3 loves, 3 endings, 2 deaths, 1 departure, grief and recovery, and grief again, and the long, empty interim. That reading is not wrong. Her life, arranged in that way, is genuinely sad. But there is another reading. In that reading, Olenka's life is a series of complete loves, each one genuine, each one total, each one given without reservation or calculation or the protective hedging that most of us bring to the business of caring for other people. She does not love Kukin moderately in case the theater fails. She does not love Pustovalov cautiously in case he gets sick. She does not hold Sasha at arm's length in case his parents reclaim him. She simply loves, fully, immediately, with everything she has. Most of us are much more careful. We have very good reasons to be. But there are moments, lying awake at night, thinking of someone we love, feeling the particular weight of how much we want them to be safe and well, when we might wonder whether our carefulness has cost us something, whether the love we parceled out so sensibly was really better than the love she gave away so freely. We don't know the answer. We suspect Chekhov didn't either. We suspect that is precisely why he wrote the story, not to answer the question, but to make us feel its weight. And then there is Sasha. There is something specifically Chekhovian about the ending, the way it arrives in the most ordinary possible moment. Not a grand reunion, not a declaration, not a scene that announces its own significance. Just a woman in a doorway, in the dark, smiling at a sleeping boy who is arguing with someone in his dream. Never had her soul surrendered to any feeling so spontaneously, Chekhov tells us, as to this maternal love for the boy, and we believe him. We feel it in the way he describes her nights, the listening for his breath, the prayers, the weight of caring for something small and alive and entirely dependent on her presence. Sasha will grow up. He will go away, as children do. The school term will end. His father will come for him. And Olenka will be left again, in some form, with the courtyard and the porch and the cats and the quiet evenings. But tonight she is in a doorway, and she is smiling, and the house is full. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is all any of us can honestly claim at any given moment. Not that it will last, not that we have figured it out, just that right now, tonight, the house is full and the heart is full, and the person we love is breathing safely under their blanket. That is enough. It is more than enough. One last thing before we go. Chekhov himself knew something about love given at a distance. His marriage to Olga Knipper was conducted largely by letter, 800 letters across the miles between Yalta and Moscow, between a sick man and the woman he loved who had her own life to live. He knew what it was to love someone and not be able to be with them. He knew what it was to be loved by someone who could not be there. Perhaps that is why this story is so careful with Olenka, so gentle, so unwilling to mock her, or diminish her, or reduce her to a joke about women who cannot exist without men. She is not a joke, she is a person, a specific, warm, limited, generous, particular person who loves as well as she knows how and suffers the consequences of loving that way, and gets up the next morning and does it again. After finishing this story, we may find that we can't quite hate Olenka, and yet we can't fully love her either. Whenever she loved someone, she saw the world through his eyes. She spoke in his words, held his thoughts as if they were her own. Was that love, or was it a kind of self-erasure? Perhaps it was both. We find ourselves asking, have we ever loved someone enough to give ourselves away like that? And has anyone ever loved us the way Olenka loved, with her whole heart, without reservation? If we hesitate to answer, maybe it's because some part of us longs to love the way Olenka did, while another part of us is quietly afraid to. That's Chekhov. That's the darling. That's tonight. We hope this quiet, warm, honest little story found us all at the right moment. In a house, somewhere in a small Russian town, in the June dark, with the window open and the summer air coming in, a woman is standing in a doorway, watching a boy sleep. He is murmuring fiercely about something. She is smiling. Everything is ordinary. Everything is enough. Good night.